In the sacrosanct halls of the Vatican, an unholy revelry unfolded, orchestrated by the very man charged with upholding the Church's moral authority. Hidden deep in the Vatican archives lies a document so scandalous that the Catholic Church has spent centuries trying to bury it. It is not the rantings of enemies, not the propaganda of heretics. It is the diary entry of a man whose only duty was to record the truth. The date, October 30, 1501. The place, the Apostolic Palace, the heart of Christendom. The papal master of ceremonies, Johann Burchard, describes a night that would echo through history. In his calm, unembellished Latin, he tells of how 50 prostitutes were brought into the Pope's palace. They were ordered to strip, their clothes discarded, their bodies left bare before the cardinals of the Church. Candelabras were lowered to the floor, their flickering light reflecting on polished marble. Chestnuts were scattered across the ground. The women, on hands and knees, crawled across the stones to collect them, their skin glowing in the candlelight as men of God looked on. But the spectacle did not end there. What followed was even more shocking, a sexual endurance contest, staged and presided over by the Pope himself. According to Burchard, prizes of silk tunics, fine shoes, and jewelry were offered to those who could perform the act most frequently with the courtesans. The Supreme Pontiff, the Vicar of Christ, the man who claimed to hold the keys to heaven and hell, had turned the Vatican into a stage for unholy theater. Now, if this were a rumor whispered by enemies, we might dismiss it as exaggeration. But this was no rumor. This account comes from Burchard, a man whose job was to write down Vatican ceremonies with precision and restraint. His diaries are normally dry, filled with names, dates, and procedural notes. If he wrote it, he believed it happened. And that is why this story has haunted the Catholic Church for more than 500 years. But here is the truly unsettling part: the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts was not the worst of Alexander VI's crimes. It was not even close. This was a man who, while sitting on the papal throne, openly acknowledged his illegitimate children. A man who kept a teenage mistress in the sacred halls of the Vatican, flaunting her as though scandal meant nothing. A man who ordered assassinations, stranglings, and poisonings of rivals and family alike. A man who literally purchased the papacy with wagon-loads of silver, corrupting the very office meant to be the spiritual cornerstone of the Christian world. For more than a decade, from 1492 to 1503, Rodrigo Borgia, known to history as Pope Alexander VI, transformed the papacy into a personal empire of lust, greed, and blood. He was not the only corrupt Renaissance pope, but he was the most brazen, the most shameless, the most dangerous. And the Church has been trying to make the world forget his name ever since. If you want more hidden histories like this, truths buried for centuries, subscribe to Disturbing Tales now and turn on notifications. These are the stories the world doesn't want you to hear. Some might ask, why focus on this? Why dredge up the sins of a man dead half a millennium? Because Alexander VI represents a turning point in history. His papacy was not just a series of scandals, it was a symptom of a deeper sickness within the Church. The late 15th century was a time when Rome had become as much a battlefield of politics as it was a center of faith. Popes acted like princes, waging wars, forming alliances, and marrying off relatives. But Alexander VI went further. He blurred every line between the sacred and the profane. He flaunted his mistresses as openly as his cardinals. He turned nepotism into an art form, flooding the highest offices with his kin. He treated salvation as merchandise, selling indulgences and offices to the highest bidder. And in doing so, he created a crisis of legitimacy so profound that it would soon explode into the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther, still a boy when Alexander died, grew up in a church scarred by his excesses. When Luther later railed against corruption in Rome, the shadow of the Borgias loomed large. But before we get to the consequences, before we understand how Alexander's sins reshaped Christianity, we must first understand the man himself. Rodrigo Borgia did not begin as a tyrant. He was born into privilege, groomed for greatness, and lifted into power by family ties. His rise was not the story of an outcast clawing his way up, but of a man born to corruption, who found in Rome the perfect stage for his ambitions. This is the story of Rodrigo Borgia's journey from a Spanish boy to the most infamous pope in history. It is a story of lust and murder, of silver and poison, of how one man turned the Vatican into a dynasty's playground. And it begins not in Rome, but in Valencia, Spain, where the child who would become Alexander VI first opened his eyes. To understand the man who would become Pope Alexander VI, we must go back to his beginnings, to Spain in the early 15th century. Rodrigo Borgia was not born in Rome, but in the Kingdom of Valencia, on January 1, 1431. His birth name was Rodrigo de Borja. The Borja family, later Italianized into Borgia, was a minor noble house, not royalty, but well-connected. His mother, Isabella de Borja, was the sister of Alfonso de Borja, a rising churchman who would soon shape Rodrigo's destiny. Alfonso was a clever and ambitious cleric, skilled in both theology and politics. When Rodrigo was still a child, Alfonso's influence propelled him upward, eventually placing him on the papal throne as Pope Calixtus III in 1455. For Rodrigo, this family connection would prove everything. Rodrigo's early years in Valencia gave him the manners and confidence of nobility, but it was his education in Italy that molded him into the cunning operator he would become. Alfonso de Borja summoned his young nephew to Rome and secured for him a place at the University of Bologna, one of the finest centers of learning in Europe. There, Rodrigo immersed himself in the study of law, canon law and civil law. The legal training sharpened his mind for the world of contracts, disputes, and negotiations. It was not only about doctrine, it was about power, money, and authority. A strong foundation for a man destined to navigate the treacherous waters of Vatican politics. Those who knew him as a student often remarked on his physical presence. Rodrigo was tall, broad-shouldered, and strikingly handsome by the standards of his day. His appearance alone commanded attention, but combined with his intelligence and charm, it made him irresistible. He learned quickly that persuasion was not only about arguments but about presence, about making others believe in him, or at least fear losing his favor. In 1456, his uncle, now Pope Calixtus III, rewarded Rodrigo for his loyalty and potential. At just 25 years old, Rodrigo was appointed a cardinal and named vice-chancellor of the Roman Catholic Church. The vice-chancellor was no ceremonial post. It was one of the most powerful administrative roles in the Vatican, overseeing the papal chancery, the bureaucracy through which papal decrees, appointments, and finances flowed. It was here that Rodrigo first tasted the intoxicating blend of politics and wealth that defined his career. The position came with enormous income, and Rodrigo was not shy about using it. He became known for his extravagant banquets, fine clothes, and luxurious palaces. Even in his youth, he displayed the appetites that would one day scandalize Europe. But indulgence was only part of the story. Rodrigo also proved himself a brilliant administrator. He was meticulous with records, efficient in decision-making, and ruthless in handling disputes. Unlike many nobles who coasted on their family names, Rodrigo worked hard at mastering the machinery of church governance. From the beginning, Rodrigo's character was marked by contradiction. On one hand, he was a competent, even gifted bureaucrat, able to manage the church's vast resources. On the other, he was a man of deep passions, whose private life was littered with affairs and illegitimate children. The contradiction was not unusual in Renaissance Rome. Many churchmen, even cardinals, kept mistresses and indulged in excess. But what set Rodrigo apart was how unapologetic he was. Where others hid, he flaunted. Where others feared scandal, he thrived in it. Rodrigo's rise was not built on merit alone. His uncle, Pope Calixtus III, placed family above all else. Nepotism was a common practice in Renaissance Rome, so common that the word itself comes from nepot, meaning nephew. Popes routinely promoted their relatives to high office, both to secure loyalty and to extend their dynasty's influence. Rodrigo was the prime beneficiary of this system. Calixtus loaded him with wealth, power, and connections. But when Calixtus died in 1458, Rodrigo's future was suddenly uncertain. A new pope, Pius II, took the throne, and often new popes stripped the relatives of their predecessors of influence. But Rodrigo was no ordinary nephew. He charmed, persuaded, and adapted. Unlike other Borgia relatives who fell from grace, Rodrigo retained his position as vice-chancellor under 4 successive popes. This was no small feat. It showed that even without his uncle, Rodrigo had the political skills to survive in the cutthroat world of the Curia. It was also during these years that Rodrigo's private reputation began to spread. In 1460, he was accused by Pope Pius II himself of scandalous behavior. The Pope wrote a stern letter rebuking him for attending a party in Siena with ladies of doubtful character. The letter accused him of dancing and engaging in improper conduct not befitting a cardinal. Rodrigo, of course, ignored the warning. If anything, the incident showed how far he was willing to push the boundaries. His charisma and wealth made him popular among Rome's elite families, and his affairs with noblewomen, and sometimes even married women, were whispered across the city. Despite the scandals, Rodrigo remained indispensable. His combination of administrative talent and political cunning made him valuable to every pope who followed Calixtus. He became a master at balancing alliances. He knew when to offer favors, when to demand loyalty, and when to bribe. Bribery, in fact, became one of his most effective tools. He amassed enormous wealth, both from his position and from benefices granted to him, and he used that wealth to buy influence. By the 1470s and 1480s, Rodrigo was one of the most powerful men in Rome. He controlled vast estates, commanded armies of servants, and had the ear of kings and princes. He was more than a churchman, he was a statesman, a broker of deals, a man whose nod could make or break a career. Rodrigo also fathered numerous children during these years, openly acknowledging them despite his vows of celibacy. Among them were Cesare Borgia, who would later become one of the most feared military commanders of the Renaissance, and Lucrezia Borgia, whose name would forever be linked with intrigue, poison, and scandal. Unlike other clerics who hid their illegitimate offspring, Rodrigo embraced his role as a father. He arranged advantageous marriages, secured titles, and poured money into their futures. To him, the papacy and its wealth were tools to build not just spiritual authority but a dynastic empire. By the time Pope Innocent VIII died in 1492, Rodrigo Borgia had spent nearly 4 decades at the heart of Vatican politics. He had survived the fall of his uncle, weathered accusations of immorality, and built alliances across Italy and beyond. He was wealthy, experienced, and cunning. Most importantly, he knew how to play the game of papal elections. The College of Cardinals, which would choose the next pope, was rife with ambition and greed. Votes could be swayed by promises, bribes, and favors. Rodrigo had spent years preparing for this moment, stockpiling wealth and cultivating loyalty. When the conclave of 1492 was convened, Rodrigo Borgia was not just a candidate. He was a front-runner. He was ready to pay whatever price was necessary to secure the highest office in Christendom. If this story is drawing you in, don't miss the next part. Hit the like button now, it tells me to keep digging into history's darkest secrets. The rise of Rodrigo Borgia was complete. From a Spanish boy born into a modest noble family, he had climbed the ladder of the church to stand on the brink of ultimate power. But the methods he used to reach the throne would set the tone for everything that followed. The year was 1492. Across Europe, winds of change were blowing. In Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella had just completed the Reconquista, expelling the last Muslim rulers from Granada. In the Atlantic, Christopher Columbus was preparing to sail westward, chasing dreams of a new route to Asia. And in Rome, the papacy itself stood at a crossroads. Pope Innocent VIII was dead. The throne of St. Peter, the most powerful spiritual office in the world, was vacant. Now the decision lay in the hands of the College of Cardinals, 24 men cloistered inside the Sistine Chapel, tasked with choosing the next successor of St. Peter. It was meant to be a sacred duty, guided by prayer and divine inspiration. But in practice, papal elections in the Renaissance were often spectacles of bribery, backroom deals, and raw ambition. And no one understood this better than Rodrigo Borgia. The conclave began in early August. Cardinals from across Europe gathered in Rome, each bringing with them the hopes of kings, dukes, and cities that had backed their campaigns. Two frontrunners quickly emerged: Giuliano della Rovere, a fierce and ambitious Italian cardinal backed by France, and Rodrigo Borgia, the seasoned vice-chancellor with decades of experience and mountains of wealth. From the beginning, it was clear that Borgia had an advantage. Della Rovere had powerful supporters, but Rodrigo had something even more persuasive: money, influence, and promises he was willing to deliver without hesitation. In an age when simony, the buying and selling of church offices, was technically condemned but widely practiced, Rodrigo took the practice to an entirely new level. Before the cardinals entered the conclave, Borgia had already begun spreading his wealth. He promised lucrative benefices, castles, and bishoprics to those willing to cast their votes for him. He secured entire families with pledges of political favor. The Orsini, one of Rome's most powerful dynasties, were assured that their lands and privileges would be protected. The Sforza family of Milan received promises of military support and lucrative appointments. Cardinals from Spain were bound to him by ties of kinship and national pride. The most decisive deal was struck with Ascanio Sforza, brother of the Duke of Milan. Borgia promised him nothing less than the office of vice-chancellor, the very role Rodrigo himself had held for decades, one of the most profitable in Rome. This was no small bribe; it was handing over the keys to the Vatican's financial machinery. One by one, votes fell into place. By the time the ballots were cast, Borgia had assembled a coalition too large to be stopped. On August 11, 1492, Rodrigo Borgia was elected as the new pope. He chose the name Alexander VI, perhaps in homage to Alexander the Great, signaling ambition, conquest, and a vision of authority that reached beyond the spiritual. When the decision was announced, Rome erupted. Some cheered, particularly those who had been rewarded for their loyalty. Others despaired, muttering that the papacy had been bought like a piece of land in the marketplace. But none could deny Rodrigo's cunning. He had played the game of politics masterfully, outmaneuvering his rivals and turning the conclave into a stage for his wealth and promises. The coronation of Alexander VI was a spectacle of Renaissance grandeur. Processions wound through Rome, with banners, trumpets, and lavish displays. But behind the pageantry lay whispers. Many cardinals knew exactly how the election had been won. One contemporary wrote bitterly that the papacy was sold and bought like a piece of merchandise. Another claimed that Rodrigo's election was infamous for the most open and shameless bribery. Yet for Rodrigo, the whispers mattered little. He was pope now, and with that office came the absolute authority to reshape both the Vatican and his family's destiny. True to his promises, Alexander VI wasted no time distributing rewards to those who had secured his victory. Ascanio Sforza received the vice-chancellorship, as promised, becoming one of the wealthiest men in Rome overnight. Other cardinals who had supported him were showered with bishoprics, abbeys, and gold. This sudden outpouring of favors shocked some observers, but it was consistent with Rodrigo's lifelong approach: power was an investment, and loyalty was bought, not begged for. Not everyone accepted his election quietly. His chief rival, Giuliano della Rovere, fumed with anger. He denounced Alexander as a usurper, a man who had corrupted the holiest office with gold. Della Rovere would spend the rest of his life plotting against Alexander, forging alliances with foreign kings to try to bring him down. But in 1492, Alexander's power was unshakable. He had the keys to the Vatican treasury, the loyalty of powerful Italian families, and the prestige of the papal throne. What made Alexander's election significant was not merely the corruption behind it, but the vision he brought into office. Where other popes might have hidden their deals behind a veil of piety, Alexander reveled in them. He viewed the papacy less as a spiritual calling than as a throne, a dynasty waiting to be carved out. Almost immediately, he began advancing the fortunes of his children, Cesare, Giovanni, Lucrezia, and others. Unlike previous popes who kept illegitimate children in the shadows, Alexander flaunted them openly, as if daring anyone to challenge him. For him, the papacy was not just about guiding souls, it was about empire building. And he had just secured the greatest platform in Europe to achieve it. The election of 1492 was more than a scandal. It was a breaking point. For centuries, critics had whispered about corruption in the Church. But with Alexander VI, those whispers became undeniable truths. Here was a pope whose rise was openly bought, whose power was anchored in cash and promises, and who had no intention of hiding it. This moment planted seeds of disillusionment across Christendom. Faithful believers began to wonder, if the papacy itself could be purchased like a prize, what did that mean for the Church's claim to divine authority? It would take only a few decades for those seeds to bear fruit in the fiery words of Martin Luther and the birth of the Reformation. But in 1492, the immediate consequence was this: the Borgia family was now at the very heart of the Christian world, and Alexander VI would stop at nothing to secure their dynasty. If you're shocked at how blatantly the papacy was bought, wait until you see what Alexander did once he had power. Subscribe now to Disturbing Tale, because the real scandals are only just beginning. With the throne secured, Alexander VI began to rule in a way Rome had never seen before. His papacy would not be a reign of humility or spiritual reform. Instead, it would be an era of dynastic ambition, of nepotism, mistresses, and blood. The Vatican, once intended as a beacon of holiness, was about to become the private court of the Borgia family.
From the moment Rodrigo Borgia secured the papal throne as Alexander VI, one thing became clear: the Vatican was no longer merely the seat of Christendom. It had become the headquarters of the Borgia family empire. Where earlier popes had occasionally elevated nephews or cousins, Alexander took nepotism to unprecedented levels. He treated the papacy as a dynasty in progress, its offices, titles, and wealth not as sacred trust, but as family property. One of Alexander's first acts as pope shocked Rome: he openly acknowledged his children. For centuries, popes and cardinals had fathered illegitimate offspring, but most went to great lengths to keep them hidden, disguising them as wards or nephews. Alexander did the opposite. He paraded his sons and daughters openly, celebrated their achievements, and poured the Church's wealth into securing their futures. His most famous children, Cesare, Giovanni, and Lucrezia would soon become infamous names across Europe. But there were others too: Joffre, who would marry into Neapolitan nobility, and several daughters placed into advantageous alliances. The message was unmistakable: the Borgia name would not be confined to Spain or Italy, it would dominate the entire Catholic world. Perhaps the most remarkable of Alexander's children was Cesare Borgia, his second-born son. From the beginning, Cesare was the apple of his father's eye, intelligent, ambitious, and ruthless. Alexander arranged for him to be made a cardinal at just 18 years old, bypassing older, more experienced men. But Cesare was no cleric at heart. While he wore the red robes of a prince of the Church, he longed for battlefields, not altars. Still, as a cardinal, he became a central figure in his father's administration, wielding enormous influence in papal politics. In time, Cesare would cast aside the cardinal's hat for the sword, becoming one of the most feared military commanders in Italy. But in the early years of Alexander's papacy, his elevation showed how little the pope cared for tradition or merit. What mattered was family. Next was Giovanni Borgia, Alexander's eldest son. For him, Alexander reserved military and noble titles. Giovanni was made Duke of Gandia, commander of papal forces, and showered with wealth. The Pope openly celebrated Giovanni's accomplishments with lavish banquets and processions, further blurring the line between church and family. To Rome's nobility, it was a clear statement: papal offices and honors were no longer prizes for the most loyal clerics, they were the inheritance of the Borgia bloodline. Then came Lucrezia, Alexander's beloved daughter. Still a teenager when her father became pope, she was used as a pawn in the web of alliances Alexander wove across Italy. He arranged marriages for her with ruthless calculation, each one designed to bind the Borgias to powerful families. Her first marriage was to Giovanni Sforza, tying the Borgias to the influential Sforza clan of Milan. When that alliance no longer suited Alexander's purposes, he annulled the marriage, humiliating Giovanni and showing the world how disposable alliances could be. Later, Lucrezia would marry Alfonso of Aragon, linking the Borgias to the Neapolitan royal house. Her marriages made her one of the most politically significant women in Italy, and her name would forever be entangled in rumors of poison, betrayal, and scandal. Even the youngest son, Joffre, was not left out. Barely in his teens, he was married off to Sancha of Aragon, another link to Naples. Through these marriages, Alexander positioned his family at the crossroads of Italian politics, securing allies in Milan, Naples, and beyond. What made Alexander's nepotism extraordinary was not simply the appointments, it was the brazenness with which he pursued them. He transformed the Vatican into a family court. Positions of power were handed not to the devout or the capable, but to the Borgias and their allies. Cardinals were elevated based on loyalty rather than learning. Lands and titles were distributed to secure marriages. Even the papal armies were commanded by Borgia sons. In effect, the church became a mechanism to expand the family's reach. To Alexander, the papacy was less about saving souls and more about building a Borgia dynasty that could rival Europe's greatest houses. Of course, this blatant nepotism bred enemies. Powerful Roman families like the Orsini and the Colonna, long accustomed to papal favor, bristled at the sudden dominance of the Spanish-born Borgias. Rival cardinals, especially Giuliano della Rovere, the man who had lost the conclave to Rodrigo, denounced Alexander as corrupt and illegitimate. Della Rovere in particular became Alexander's most implacable foe. He fled Rome, seeking foreign support, and vowed to destroy the Borgia pope. His hatred would shadow Alexander's reign until the end. But Alexander and his children did not shrink from confrontation. Cesare and Giovanni used violence as readily as diplomacy to suppress their rivals. Assassinations, kidnappings, and poisonings became tools of Borgia politics. When alliances failed, daggers and chalices succeeded. In Rome, whispers spread that the Borgias held secret councils where enemies were invited, dined with, and never left alive. Whether all these tales were true hardly mattered, the perception itself was enough to cement their reputation. The nepotism of Alexander VI had profound consequences for the church itself. Sacred offices were turned into bargaining chips. The spiritual authority of the papacy was traded for dynastic gain. Pilgrims who came to Rome seeking holiness found instead a court dripping with luxury, scandal, and whispered rumors of murder. Even within the church, disillusionment spread. Reform-minded clerics saw in Alexander the embodiment of everything corrupt, a pope who had abandoned his duty for his dynasty. Alexander VI's nepotism was more than favoritism. It was a systematic transformation of the papacy into a family business. His reign blurred the line between church and state, between spiritual authority and worldly ambition. By raising his children to positions of immense power, he ensured that the Borgia name would dominate the Italian stage. But he also ensured that the papacy itself would become synonymous with corruption, decadence, and scandal. The very institution meant to embody the purity of Christ was now seen as the plaything of one family. For believers across Europe, this was a betrayal that could not be ignored. If you're stunned by how the Vatican became a family empire, hit that like button now, and share this story so more people can see how history was truly written. By the mid-1490s, the Borgia family stood at the height of its power. Cesare commanded influence as a cardinal, Giovanni led papal armies, Lucrezia secured alliances through marriage, and Joffre bound the family to Naples. But with great power came even greater danger. Rival families plotted revenge, alliances crumbled, and enemies massed on all sides. And when Giovanni Borgia's body was fished out of the Tiber River in 1497, throat slit and riddled with stab wounds, it became clear, the Borgia dynasty was not only built on blood, it was destined to be consumed by it. In the chronicles of papal history, no figure drew more whispers of scandal than Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI. While many popes before him were accused of questionable morals, Alexander's personal life was uniquely public, audacious, and impossible to ignore. His reign blurred the line between sacred duty and private indulgence, exposing the Vatican to ridicule across Europe. At the center of his most infamous controversies were his mistresses, relationships that not only violated vows of celibacy but also altered the course of politics, alliances, and the very structure of Renaissance power. Long before he ascended to the papal throne, Rodrigo Borgia became involved with Vanazza de Catania, a widowed Roman woman of charm and intelligence. Their relationship was neither fleeting nor hidden. For nearly 2 decades, Vanazza remained his primary partner, bearing him 4 children who would become key players in his dynastic ambitions: Cesare, Giovanni, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey Borgia. In an era when clerical mistresses were quietly tolerated if kept discreet, Rodrigo's relationship with Vanazza was strikingly open. He secured her financial stability by granting her estates and properties, and he placed her under the protection of powerful allies. Even as a cardinal, Rodrigo lived less like a celibate priest and more like a Renaissance prince, surrounded by women, wealth, and intrigue. Vanazza's role was pivotal. She gave the Borgia name continuity and legitimacy within Rome, creating a family line that Rodrigo could leverage politically once he became pope. Their children, though technically illegitimate, were publicly acknowledged. A radical act in an institution founded on vows of chastity. Yet as Alexander VI aged, his desires did not fade. Around 1489, he began a new relationship with Giulia Farnese, a strikingly beautiful woman barely in her teens when she married Orsino Orsini, a nobleman with connections to the Vatican. Almost immediately after her marriage, Giulia was swept into Alexander's orbit. Giulia became infamous in Rome under the nickname Giulia la Bella, Giulia the Beautiful. Critics mocked her as the Bride of Christ, a cruel jab at her intimate bond with the Pope. Even foreign ambassadors commented on the scandal, noting that she was often housed within Vatican palaces and treated with extraordinary favor. Her influence extended beyond mere companionship. Giulia's brother, Alessandro Farnese, directly benefited from her relationship with the Pope. Through her intervention, Alessandro was elevated to the College of Cardinals in 1493, an appointment so blatantly tied to papal indulgence that contemporaries sneered at him as the Cardinal of the Petticoat. This act of nepotism disguised as ecclesiastical promotion cemented the Farnese family's rise in Roman politics. Indeed, Alessandro Farnese's career did not end with Alexander's papacy. Decades later, he himself ascended the papal throne as Pope Paul III. Thus, Giulia's presence in Alexander's bedchamber altered not just the reputation of his pontificate, but the trajectory of Catholic leadership for generations. These liaisons transformed the papal court into a theater of rumor and resentment. Where past popes had relied on quiet discretion, Alexander flaunted his relationships openly. Banquets were hosted in Vatican halls where mistresses and courtiers mingled freely. Foreign dignitaries wrote home, astonished at the liberties taken in what was supposed to be Christendom's most sacred seat. Some envoys painted lurid pictures of the papal household. They described evenings when courtesans danced before the Pope and his family, and whispered of lavish entertainments that blurred the line between religious ceremony and worldly indulgence. Whether all of these accounts were accurate or exaggerated mattered little. The perception of moral corruption was enough to stain Alexander's reign. His mistresses became symbols of everything critics despised about Renaissance Rome: greed, lust, and the abandonment of spiritual ideals. The most enduring scandal of Alexander's private life, however, involved not his lovers, but his daughter Lucrezia Borgia. To hostile chroniclers, Lucrezia was portrayed as a femme fatale, a tool of her father's ambitions, and, most damningly, a participant in incestuous rumors that spread like wildfire. Alexander used Lucrezia as a political pawn, arranging and dissolving marriages based on shifting alliances. Each union was meant to strengthen the Borgia hold over Italy, but the frequency with which her marriages were annulled fed gossip. When her first husband was cast aside, tongues wagged that she was too closely bound to her father and brother Cesare to be shared with another man. Though historians now view many of these claims as slander spread by enemies, the perception at the time was damaging. Lucrezia became the embodiment of papal corruption in popular imagination, a woman both victimized and vilified, trapped within her father's web of power. The open nature of Alexander's private life was not merely embarrassing, it carried political consequences. Reformers across Europe seized on his behavior as proof that the papacy had strayed irredeemably from its mission. In sermons and pamphlets, his name became synonymous with sin. For monarchs, too, his scandals were ammunition. Rival powers such as France and Spain could point to Rome's decadence as justification for intervention in Italian affairs. In the eyes of many, the Vatican was no longer the moral compass of Christendom but a corrupt court indistinguishable from the worldly monarchies it sought to influence. It is easy to dismiss Alexander's affairs as private indulgences, but in the context of the Renaissance, they symbolized something far more dangerous. The Pope was not just a man, he was the representative of God on earth. By flaunting mistresses and elevating their families, Alexander blurred the boundary between divine authority and personal appetite. Every whispered rumor, every mocking nickname, chipped away at the papacy's credibility. His indulgences were not just fodder for gossip, they undermined faith in the very institution he was meant to protect. If you've followed the story this far, you can see how one man's private desires reshaped the destiny of the Church. It's a reminder that history is not only written in battles and treaties, but also in secrets whispered in bedrooms. If you want more stories like this, where power, scandal, and faith collide, make sure to subscribe and join us. By the end of the 1490s, Alexander VI stood as both the most powerful and the most maligned pope in living memory. His mistresses secured alliances, his children became rulers, and his court overflowed with wealth and rumor. To his supporters, he was a cunning statesman who used every tool at his disposal. To his critics, he was the very embodiment of vice in holy robes. What could not be denied was that his personal life had become inseparable from his papacy. The scandals of Rodrigo Borgia were not distractions from his reign, they were his reign, shaping politics, alliances, and the future of Christendom itself. Among the many stories whispered about Alexander VI, none captured the imagination, or the disgust, of contemporaries more than the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts. Whether entirely factual, embellished, or outright fabricated by enemies, the tale became emblematic of the moral decay that critics saw within the Vatican. It was not simply a banquet. It was remembered as a symbol of power corrupted, of sacred halls turned into stages for earthly indulgence. By the late 1490s, the Borgia court was at the height of its influence. Cesare Borgia commanded armies, Lucrezia Borgia served as both daughter and political intermediary, and Pope Alexander VI reveled in his control over Rome. Wealth flowed into the papal treasury through taxes, indulgences, and alliances, funding not only military campaigns but also a lifestyle of grandeur. It was in this atmosphere of triumph and excess that the notorious banquet allegedly unfolded. According to Johann Burchard, the master of ceremonies at the papal court, whose meticulous diary serves as one of our most important sources, the gathering took place in October 1501, within the apostolic palace itself. The very choice of location was scandalous. Banquets were expected in noble villas, perhaps in the homes of cardinals, but not in the sacred space of the Vatican. By hosting such an event inside the papal palace, Alexander blurred the line between holy authority and worldly decadence, turning the seat of Christendom into a theater of indulgence. Burchard described the evening with unsettling clarity. 50 courtesans, or women of loose reputation, were brought into the papal halls. They dined alongside high-ranking clergy, courtiers, and members of the Borgia household. The tables overflowed with meats, wines, and delicacies imported at great cost. But the true spectacle came after the food was cleared. As candles flickered and music echoed through the chamber, the courtesans allegedly began to dance. Their movements grew more suggestive, until, in Burchard's words, their garments were stripped away. The banquet turned into a contest of seduction, where clergy and nobles alike were invited to join in acts that defied the vows they had once sworn to uphold. Chestnuts, scattered across the floor, became part of the entertainment. The women were said to crawl on hands and knees, picking them up to the amusement of the gathered men. The image was shocking. The fruit of the earth, associated with simplicity and poverty, turned into props for humiliation within the halls of the Vatican. But the evening did not end with spectacle alone. According to Burchard, prizes were offered to those who performed with the greatest vigor. Fine clothing, jewels, or even gold awaited the men who could prove their prowess before the watching crowd. The Pope's own son, Cesare, was rumored to have taken part, further entwining the scandal with the Borgia name. For those present, it was more than a night of debauchery, it was a performance of dominance. The Pope, his family, and their allies demonstrated that they were above ordinary rules. In a city filled with gossip and resentment, they displayed power not through sermons or decrees, but through unrestrained indulgence. Whether every detail of Burchard's account was true is a matter of debate. Some historians believe his descriptions were exaggerated or influenced by enemies of the Borgias, eager to portray Alexander's court as a den of sin. Others argue that even if the banquet was embellished, the fact that it was widely believed speaks volumes about the Pope's reputation. For reformers across Europe, the story of the Banquet of Chestnuts was irresistible. Here was proof, they claimed, that the papacy had abandoned its divine mission. Priests who preached poverty were feasting on gold and flesh. The shepherd of Christendom was hosting orgies. Whether factual or not, the tale became a weapon in the growing movement that demanded reform of the Church. The banquet left scars not only on the reputation of Alexander VI, but on the collective imagination of Europe. Pamphlets and whispered rumors spread from Rome to Paris, from Florence to London. The Vatican was no longer just the spiritual heart of Christendom, it was portrayed as a theater of sin. Artists and poets seized on the imagery, creating works that blurred fact with myth. Satirical verses painted Rome as a new Babylon, while sermons invoked the banquet as evidence of the world's decay. The image of courtesans crawling for chestnuts became a shorthand for papal corruption, echoing for centuries as the ultimate symbol of moral decline. This scandal did not exist in a vacuum. Alexander's enemies, whether in Florence, Naples, or France, used it to undermine his authority. Kings who once sought papal approval now questioned whether his blessings carried any spiritual weight. Diplomats reported home with horror, adding fuel to the fire of political rivalries. Even within Rome, the tale divided the faithful. Some shrugged it off, accustomed to the vices of powerful men. Others, however, were shaken to their core, questioning how God could allow such men to sit on Peter's throne. The gap between the Church's message and its practice widened, preparing the ground for future upheavals. The Banquet of Chestnuts is not remembered merely because it was salacious. It mattered because it symbolized the collision between sacred authority and human vice. Whether every detail was true or not, the perception was enough: the papacy had lost its moral compass. Alexander VI may have believed he was untouchable, secure in his wealth and power. Yet history would prove otherwise. His scandals, embodied in that infamous banquet, became rallying cries for those who sought to challenge the Vatican's grip on Europe. Stories like this remind us how fragile power truly is. One night of excess, one whispered rumor, can alter the destiny of nations. If you're finding this history as shocking as those who first heard it centuries ago, make sure you subscribe and stay with us, because the unraveling of the Borgias is only just beginning. By the dawn of the 16th century, the Banquet of Chestnuts had cemented its place in history. It was more than a feast. It was a symbol, a metaphor for a papacy that indulged in everything it preached against. Whether fact or fable, it has endured as one of the darkest stains on the legacy of Pope Alexander VI. In the memory of Europe, the chestnuts never stopped rolling across the Vatican floor. Pope Alexander VI's reign was not only a spectacle of indulgence and scandal, it was a reign soaked in ambition, blood, and ruthless political maneuvering. If the Banquet of Chestnuts revealed the extremes of his personal vice, the darker chapters of his papacy showed how far he and his family would go to consolidate power in Italy. In Renaissance Rome, the papacy was as much a political office as a spiritual one, and Alexander VI approached it with the precision of a general and the cunning of a chess master. Every alliance was calculated, every favor bought, and every enemy eliminated, sometimes permanently. Central to Alexander's political strategy was Cesare Borgia, his eldest legitimate son, who became the sword and shield of the family's ambitions. Initially destined for a church career, Cesare was made a cardinal at the age of 18. Yet unlike his father, who had navigated scandal with charm and bribery, Cesare had a single-minded focus: power. Alexander's nepotism ensured Cesare held both ecclesiastical influence and military authority. By 1499, Cesare had abandoned his cardinalate entirely, opting to lead armies to expand Borgia territories across central Italy. Cities and fortresses fell under his control with remarkable speed, yet each conquest was accompanied by brutal tactics. Resistance was met with execution or exile, leaving a trail of terror that secured both obedience and fear. The Borgia strategy was unflinchingly ruthless. Enemies, whether noble families or former allies, were removed with deadly precision. One of the most notorious cases involved Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisceglie and husband to Lucrezia Borgia. While he initially survived a violent attack on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica in 1500, he could not escape the family's wrath. Weeks later, he was found strangled in his bed in the Vatican itself, a clear demonstration that the Borgias would eliminate any obstacle, even within their own walls. Such murders were not mere acts of vengeance, they were political instruments. By eliminating rivals, Alexander and Cesare consolidated power, redistributed estates to loyalists, and sent an unmistakable message: the Borgia family would tolerate no dissent. Other high-profile deaths also raised suspicion. Giovanni Borgia, Duke of Gandia and Alexander's favorite son, disappeared after leaving a party in 1497. His body was later recovered in the Tiber River, stabbed 9 times. Though many speculated that Cesare orchestrated the killing out of jealousy or ambition, Alexander himself seemed paralyzed, mourning briefly but taking no action against the suspected perpetrator. This incident reflected the brutal pragmatism of the Borgias. Family loyalty was subordinate to the consolidation of power. Ambassadors and chroniclers from across Europe recorded these incidents with horror. The papal court, they noted, had become a place where poison, murder, and betrayal were tools of governance, wielded as openly as proclamations and decrees. Political marriages were another instrument in Alexander's arsenal. Lucrezia Borgia's multiple marriages were orchestrated to serve the family's ambitions, forging alliances that strengthened Borgia influence in Milan, Ferrara, and beyond. When these unions no longer served strategic purposes, they were annulled, often under scandalous pretenses. Critics spread rumors of incest and inappropriate behavior, painting Lucrezia as both pawn and accomplice in her father's schemes. Every marriage, every annulment, and every alliance reinforced the image of the Borgias as a family whose loyalty was to itself above all else. These maneuvers extended Alexander's power across Italy, ensuring that even cities nominally independent of Rome fell under Borgia influence. Fear was as much a tool as marriage or military conquest. Alexander's enemies learned quickly that the Pope could act without consequence. Clerics who opposed him, like the reformist preacher Girolamo Savonarola, faced severe repercussions. Savonarola would eventually be excommunicated, tried, and burned at the stake in Florence, demonstrating to others the lethal consequences of dissent. Families such as the Orsini and Colonna, long-standing power brokers in Rome, suffered systematic destruction. Their lands were confiscated, estates redistributed to Borgia loyalists, and their influence eradicated. By wielding both public and private punishment, Alexander secured obedience without relying solely on armies. What made Alexander VI's use of violence especially chilling was how seamlessly it intertwined with his personal indulgences. Whereas other rulers separated private vice from political governance, Alexander fused the two. Banquets, mistresses, and scandalous entertainments were not distractions. They reinforced his image as a man unbound by ordinary law, capable of daring acts that others would fear to attempt. Even acts that seemed purely indulgent, like hosting the Banquet of Chestnuts or openly flaunting his children and mistresses, were political theater. They displayed dominance, loyalty, and control, signaling that Alexander's power extended beyond the Vatican walls. By the time Alexander's health began to decline in 1503, the Borgias had transformed the papacy into a hereditary power structure, merging ecclesiastical authority with dynastic ambition. Cities were conquered, rivals eliminated, alliances forged through marriage and murder. Rome had become both a spiritual capital and a political fortress for one family, with Alexander and Cesare as architects of its dominance. Yet, as with all dynasties built on fear and excess, cracks began to appear. Death, disease, and shifting political tides would soon undo much of what the Borgias had achieved. Still, the shadow of their ruthlessness would linger, leaving Europe to ponder the lethal consequences when morality is sacrificed for power. If you're captivated by the combination of cunning, ambition, and outright ruthlessness, make sure to hit that subscribe button. This story isn't just history, it's a lesson in how power, when unchecked, can consume everything in its path. Alexander VI's reign was a masterclass in manipulation, where murder, politics, and family ambition converged. He wielded fear as expertly as armies and transformed the papal office into both a throne and a battlefield. By the end of his life, Rome was firmly under Borgia influence, yet the cost of such power, a trail of blood and betrayal, was undeniable. The papacy had become a theater of human ambition, with Alexander VI at its center. And in that theater, every banquet, every alliance, every murder told the same story: the cost of unchecked power is paid in blood. By the summer of 1503, the sprawling Borgia empire that Alexander VI had meticulously constructed began to unravel. For over a decade, the papacy had been transformed into a family enterprise, with territories, offices, and military power concentrated in the hands of Alexander and his children. Yet even the most formidable dynasties are fragile, especially when built on fear, bribery, and ruthlessness rather than loyalty or law. Alexander VI, once vigorous and commanding, now suffered from age and disease. Reports from contemporaries describe a pope weakened by fever and fatigue, yet still scheming, still attentive to his political chessboard. His son Cesare, the family's enforcer, remained formidable, but without his father's direction, cracks began to show. In August 1503, both Alexander and Cesare fell ill after dining at a villa outside Rome. What began as a fever quickly escalated into violent vomiting and exhaustion. The cause was uncertain. Some suspected poisoning, a weapon the Borgias themselves had wielded countless times. Others later concluded malaria, endemic to Rome during the hot summer months, was the likely culprit. Regardless of the cause, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. Alexander's death on August 18 left the papacy without its master strategist. Cesare, weakened by illness, was unable to maintain the same level of control over his conquests or the volatile alliances he had relied upon. Within weeks of Alexander's death, former allies and enemies alike moved to reclaim power. Cities that had been under Borgia domination, held in place through fear and military might, quickly rose in rebellion. Cesare's army, stretched thin and demoralized, could not enforce the family's rule across central Italy. Territories were lost, and the Borgia military campaign that had seemed unstoppable only months before collapsed in the face of coordinated opposition. The new pope, Julius II, Alexander's political rival, moved decisively to dismantle Borgia influence. Loyalists were stripped of offices, lands were returned to families previously dispossessed, and key Borgia allies were exiled or neutralized. Rome, once firmly under Borgia control, returned to a state of political balance, though the scars of Alexander's reign remained visible in both architecture and memory. Cesare, weakened by illness and political defeat, fled into exile. His once feared army disintegrated, and his territories were swiftly absorbed by surrounding states. By 1507, he met his end in Spain, killed in a minor skirmish far from the power he had once wielded so effortlessly. Cesare's death marked not only the loss of Alexander's enforcer but the symbolic end of Borgia dominance. Where once the Vatican had been a hub of both spiritual authority and dynastic power, it returned to being primarily a religious institution, albeit with lingering political intrigue. Giulia Borgia, the daughter who had been used as a pawn and instrument of political marriages, survived the collapse with remarkable adaptability. She reformed her public image, embracing roles as a duchess and patron of the arts in Ferrara. Over time, she cultivated a reputation for piety and cultural sophistication, attempting to distance herself from the scandals of her youth. By the time of her death in 1519, she had succeeded in living down much of the infamy attached to her family name. Her story highlights an essential aspect of the Borgia collapse. While the family's male members relied on violence and intimidation, Lucrezia survived through diplomacy, marriage, and careful public presentation, a stark contrast to the sudden deaths and exiles of Alexander and Cesare. With Alexander VI dead, the possibility of a hereditary papacy, a central goal of the Borgias, was permanently extinguished. Central Italy would never again see the papacy used as a personal dynastic throne, and the Catholic Church regained a measure of stability. The offices, wealth, and influence that had been concentrated in the hands of the Borgias were dispersed among rival families and the restored church hierarchy. Yet the legacy of the Borgias remained. The stories of bribery, nepotism, scandal, and bloodshed endured in chronicles, letters, and diaries, leaving a cautionary tale for generations to come. The Vatican, though cleansed of immediate Borgia control, bore permanent reminders of the extent to which human ambition could corrupt religious authority. The fall of the Borgia dynasty illustrates the inherent instability of power built on fear and vice rather than trust and principle. Alexander VI had demonstrated extraordinary skill in consolidating authority, yet his reliance on intimidation, murder, and scandal made the dynasty vulnerable to rapid collapse once the central figure was gone. History remembers the Borgias not simply for their excesses but for the lesson their rise and fall teaches about the fragility of unchecked ambition. The papacy survived, but the stories of poisonings, murders, and political intrigue cast a long shadow over the Vatican for centuries, shaping both reform movements and the perceptions of Europe toward Rome. If this story of power, corruption, and collapse has captivated you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. The rise and fall of the Borgias is more than history, it's a blueprint of ambition, a warning about how easily institutions can be manipulated by those willing to sacrifice morality for power. By the end of Alexander VI's papacy, the Borgia dynasty had crumbled under the weight of disease, betrayal, and their own ruthless ambition. What had once seemed an unstoppable family empire dissolved within months, leaving behind a legacy of scandal, intrigue, and cautionary lessons. The papacy endured, but the shadows of poison, murder, and greed lingered, forever etched in the history of Rome. The Vatican had survived the Borgias, but the memory of their reign ensured that the lessons of corruption would not be forgotten. The death of Pope Alexander VI in 1503 did not merely mark the end of a scandalous papacy, it marked a turning point in the history of the Catholic Church and European politics. While the Borgia dynasty collapsed swiftly after his death, the long shadow of Alexander VI's ambition, corruption, and audacity shaped centuries of religious, political, and cultural developments. The Vatican faced a critical reckoning in the wake of Alexander VI. His open indulgence in nepotism, scandal, and political manipulation had exposed the vulnerabilities of the Church when spiritual authority was subordinated to personal ambition. reform became unavoidable. Pope Julius II and subsequent pontiffs immediately took steps to restore credibility. Offices and benefices that had been sold or granted to Borgia loyalists were revoked. Nepotism was curtailed, at least formally, and the distribution of church wealth and authority was placed under stricter oversight. While such reforms could not erase the memory of Alexander VI's excesses, they were an acknowledgement that unchecked papal power could destabilize both the Church and Europe. Alexander VI's papacy had far-reaching political consequences. By using his children as instruments of conquest, marriage, and assassination, he demonstrated that the papacy could function as both a spiritual and temporal power. Cesare Borgia's campaigns in central Italy, though ultimately undone after Alexander's death, set a precedent for the intertwining of ecclesiastical authority with military and political ambition. The fall of the Borgias also reshaped Italian power dynamics. Formerly subjugated states, cities, and noble families seized the opportunity to reclaim autonomy. The vacuum left by the collapse of Borgia dominance allowed rival powers such as Florence, Venice, and Milan to reassert influence, and it underscored the fragility of states built on fear rather than sustainable governance. Perhaps the most profound impact of Alexander VI's papacy was the ideological shock it delivered to reformers. The corruption, nepotism, and moral excesses of his reign became central examples for those calling for systemic change within the Church. Martin Luther, who was 13 when Alexander VI died, later cited the excesses of the Renaissance popes, particularly the Borgias, as evidence of a church that had strayed far from spiritual principles. The Protestant Reformation, which reshaped the religious landscape of Europe, can trace part of its ideological roots to the scandalous precedents set during Alexander VI's reign. The papacy had demonstrated that spiritual authority could be subverted for personal gain, undermining the credibility of centuries of religious leadership. The legacy of Alexander VI extended beyond politics and religion. The Borgia family became archetypes in literature, art, and historical scholarship, a symbol of ambition, decadence, and human frailty. Chroniclers, ambassadors, and diarists of the Renaissance preserve detailed accounts of their exploits, blending horror, fascination, and moral instruction. Even the architecture and frescoes associated with the Borgias served as reminders of their power. The apartments once occupied by Alexander VI, later sealed or abandoned by successive popes, became monuments to both artistic achievement and moral decay. Rome, in its physical spaces, bore witness to the extremes of Borgia influence, an enduring testimony to the complexity of power in the Renaissance era. The story of Alexander VI remains relevant today as a study of how institutions can be corrupted from within. His rise illustrates how wealth, strategic alliances, and the normalization of unethical behavior can subvert authority, erode trust, and destabilize systems designed for governance and moral oversight. The papacy survived, but Alexander VI's reign proved that no institution, however sacred, is immune to human ambition and moral compromise. Historians often point to his ability to incrementally expand what was acceptable, beginning with private indulgences, moving to public nepotism, and culminating in open corruption, as a blueprint of institutional decay. Unlike other controversial popes who were later rehabilitated, Alexander VI's reputation remained permanently tainted. The Catholic Encyclopedia admits that he sadly neglected the spiritual interests of the Church, a formal acknowledgement that he failed in his duties at the highest level. His name became synonymous with corruption, scandal, and ruthless ambition, a cautionary tale for leaders in both religious and secular spheres. To this day, no pope has taken the name Alexander VII, VIII, or IX, reflecting the enduring stigma of his legacy. The Vatican itself preserves the memory of the Borgias in sealed apartments, in frescoes, and in the careful curation of history, ensuring that the lessons of moral failure are. If this tale of corruption, ambition, and lasting influence has captured your attention, hit that subscribe button and join us as we explore the most shocking and instructive moments of history. Understanding the past is not just entertainment, it's a guide for recognizing how power can be wielded, and sometimes abused, in any era. Alexander VI's papacy demonstrated the extraordinary consequences of merging personal ambition with institutional authority. His reign reshaped the Vatican, influenced European politics, inspired reformers, and left a legacy that is still studied and debated today. The Borgia dynasty collapsed, but the impact of their actions, both the scandals and the reforms they prompted, endures as a powerful testament to the consequences of unchecked power. The Vatican survived Alexander VI, but the lessons of his reign remain etched into its history. Power without principle carries a cost, and human ambition, when untethered, can shadow the sacred for centuries to come.